Good afternoon, everyone. Good night, Rohan, in Tokyo, and everyone else around the world, and in your bedrooms and kids' bedrooms. So we have a CWEH, Center for World Environmental History meeting about dams, as you guessed from the poster. My name is Zuki Serpa. I'm working with Vinita. I'm an artist and a GIS person. Some housekeeping. We usually, when we hold meetings, we circulate a paper to write emails, contact list. If you are interested in continuing any participation, please send your contacts after the Zoom, and Alice will probably collect some of your other contacts so we can continue and just circulate our program. Just to flag up 3 talks that are happening next week, part of a Climate Justice Week that the students are organizing in Sussex. So on the 23rd, Tuesday 23rd, we got a talk by the Tesoro Reserve in Ecuador that are restoring a rainforest and doing amazing community work with para-ecologists, a very special new way of engaging local communities in the restoration. On Thursday, our colleague Miriam Rose is going to talk about the work that Foil Vedanta did in Zambia to do with copper mining, a big scandal of mining companies and the state. And on Friday, Vinita and myself are going to talk about deforestation related to mining and climate change in the Saranda forest and in Niamgiri. So hopefully you'll get the information when it comes out. Rohan, my policy is that the speaker is best presenting himself. So from Tokyo University, late at night, please take the stage, Rohan.
Zuki, thank you so much. Just a minor set of corrections. So I'm at Kyoto, which is 600 kilometers from Tokyo. But yeah, you mostly got it right. Thank you, Zuki, also for taking the time to, along with Alice, to organize this, and also a lot of thanks to Vinita. And it's a great honor, and I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking on this topic, which I actually am trying to finish a paper. So some of the arguments might come across as being a bit tentative. So I'm hoping the learned audience here will help me finish my paper. So let me now just start with the PowerPoint. Share. That's how it goes, right? Yeah. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So may I also urge everyone, you can go mute, and also make sure that you don't need to be on the screen, so you can shut your videos, yeah, if you so choose, because I get to see lots of people on the screen. So, all right, okay, thank you. Let me begin by saying I was a little. I must say, I must begin with an apology and a qualification. There's a word that I use in the title, which is a bit too strong. I use the word love. In fact, climate change, large dams, Asia, I should have used arranged marriage, because there's more calculation rather than emotion with what I'm going to be discussing, yeah? So that aside, let me start off by actually, first slide, I have to make sure that it works. Sorry, is that, okay, page down. First technical glitch. Sorry, how does this, okay, sorry. Okay, that's it. Okay, I got it. All right, discussing climate change today, it's very necessary to possibly start off with a kind of extreme climate event. And it's not very difficult to get them these days. You can see on your screen I'm referring to what is now called the Big Freeze. This happened in Texas sometime in February this year, in which there was a polar vortex, and much of Texas actually experienced a power outage. Apparently 21 people died, but they're still counting. Millions of homes went without water, no electricity. It was terribly cold. And the point for this talk, at least, and what's important for me, and I want to keep you focused on that, is that it's not that, of course, the failure at multiple levels is something that many more studies will help establish and work through in the future. But what is interesting is some of the early analysis that came out from Big Freeze. They pointed that much of this could have been avoided, and that it could be traced to the fact that in 2004, there was electricity deregulation, in which much of Texas, about 60% of Texas residents, were buying power from private companies and not from local utilities or any kind of regulated power utilities. So at the end, what they did find out is that much of these private companies really were not able to deliver during the storms because they were busy cutting corners and making profits. So they hadn't kept enough electricity for an emergency. So what happened is that in one of the analysis, which is argued and there on the screen, that as a way to save money by turning public services and utilities over to the private sector, where the free market will lead to increased competition and lower prices, people bought into that deal. And when a crisis happened, an extreme climate event happened, what you got is the standard failure of a public good that was compromised by private services and the market. I just want you to focus on this as I begin to discuss the rest of my presentation. All right, now let's come back to large dams. There are a huge number of publications on large dams, and I would say, and many papers, and I would say enough to fill a big reservoir. And so it's very difficult to actually set up a kind of a reading list or tell you which are the books to roughly follow. But there are a few that I think would give you a rough sense of how this debate actually worked out, and what some of the initial writers on the subject, how they set the field. That having been said, I will just say that the books that I've put on this screen, and I'm going to then subsequently argue that they are somewhat outdated when you're thinking and reflecting on current conditions. They're great histories, but they will not necessarily help you explain the phenomenon of large dams as it unfolds today in South Asia and many other parts of the world. So let me get to the next question. When we use the word large dams, there's a little bit of a debate that what is a dam and what is a large dam? And there are often writings which suggest that this has been an old kind of technology, and it's only begun to be understood in a conventional sense today as a large dam, but historically it's very ancient technology. I would beg to differ. I would argue that the large dams that we're really talking about today are the ones that really, the defining moment is the Tennessee Valley Association dams. Roughly 26 dams, an entire logic initiated in 1933 by Delano Roosevelt. The idea underlying this was what a watershed, forgive the pun, was a watershed in the sense that it marked a new way in which dams were made to relate to the economy, to politics, to modernization, and to, in several ways, creating the idea of the modern itself. Yeah. So if there is a foundational moment for the modern large dam, it would definitely, in my opinion, and I would like, happy to take questions on that and argue this, would definitely be the TVA, Tennessee Valley Association project. And it's very striking how the TVA was rhetorically and conceptually put forward. Yeah, for the first time, a dam was not only about irrigation. Yeah, it was brought together to speak to flood control, navigation, and irrigation. But fundamentally, and this is very crucial for the TVA, it's very hard to understand the TVA if one is not really aware. The TVA is actually a big fight for public electricity. United States in 1933, there was throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was quite a brutal fight between private electric companies who were not willing to extend electricity because it's a question of charging a huge price. And then there were many who felt that if electricity was cheap, it would give a huge bounce for the economy. So TVA actually entered that debate by saying electricity for all. It's a public electricity, and they cheapened electricity rates. And around that idea of a public utility, the kind of philosophy was also worked out. The lessons of, which David Leonthal, one of the most famous directors of the TVA, wrote a book in 1944, Democracy on the March, in which he spells out very cleanly the links. So he says, the lessons of the unity of resource development was the close interrelationship between electricity and industry, between industry and farming, between farming and the building of the soil, between soil and flood control. So a huge set of linkages that actually announce a new kind of interdependent, unified way of creating the modern. In fact, if you look at how big dams begin to emerge in South Asia in the 1950s and 60s, post-decolonization, it's really the TVA sensibility of combining assets, benefits, resources, and creating a kind of idea of development around that. So I should also mention as a side anecdote, TVA engineers were very desired. In fact, Nehru went a couple of times to the US, desperately trying to get one, and he couldn't. They were that valued by many countries across the world. Though India did have their own Tennessee Valley Association projects, the Damodar Valley Association project, which did come up, and Kling & Smith's 2007 book, One Valley and 1,000, kind of captures and discusses that moment. But what I want to underline in this is that the TVA set the template, and pretty much very soon, large dam constructions began to multiply all across the world. And if you were to, one of the Patrick McCulley's book called Silence Rivers, in which he mentions that between, from the 1940s to almost the 1990s or 2000, we've got 40,000 large dams come up all across the world at various heights and various levels. And by 1997, there's enough movements against large dams happening that a famous commission was put together called the World Commission on Dams. And it's very interesting that actually the Dams and Development report that they brought out in 2000 pretty much very acutely, very with great insight actually captures this entire period from 45 to 2000. I mean, I find that document as very seminal. It's a document that if one carefully reads, one gets a good sense of history. There's a huge and careful collection of environmental issues, social issues, etc., etc. But but it marks one very important point, and I just want to flag that. So between 1970 and 75, sorry, that should be 85. Nearly 5,000 large dams were built, resulting in a dam building frenzy of approximately 3 dam starts per day for 5 years. Sorry, that's 70 to 75. The dam building wave began in richer countries and then slowly moved south. However, in the 1980s and even more so in the 1990s, dam projects excited controversy. This is what it says in the introduction by Kader Samal. And the number of large dams actually fell from a high of 5,418 in 1970 to 2,069 in the 1990s. And the downward trend is continuing. This is when the World Commission on Dams is actually studying the whole large dam construction movement. They're actually catching the movement as it is sliding down. Yeah, and he says at the end of his introduction, says dams are no longer seen as the proud symbols of progress they once were. And in that, we get a huge kind of discussion of all the ills and also some of the benefits that come with dams. Yeah, and so these kinds of pictures that I put on, it's really not complicated in the sense that one could recite all of them. It does give you energy and water supply, but there's sedimentation of the large dams, flood habitats and cultures, flood utilization cultures are destroyed. There's displacement. There's a lot of, for example, loss of fisheries, there's salinity, waterlogging, even as food is enhanced. Yeah, so you get a mixed bag, which the WCD or the World Commission on Dams was careful to document and to present. Then there were also issues about corruption, and there was a study done by Oxford University, which they cite. They don't cite, but for example, you have all dams were built between 1934 and 2007, Mark 34, that is the TVA, yeah, for which reliable data exists. They found that 96% of them had cost overruns. That is the claim for benefits, again, completely debatable. And 44% went through time overruns. Yeah. So the overall message was that we find that even before accounting for negative impacts on human society and environment, the actual construction costs of large dams are too high to yield a positive return. Now, this is something that is beginning to set in by 1990, 2000. It's very clear. The appetite for building large dams is over. And the fact that they find that the benefits that they had claimed really didn't always match up with the numbers. Yeah. And so at the end, the WCD actually suggests a kind of, even though many people call this document a draw, it didn't take any side. They said there were benefits, but there were losses. But if you read the subtext, look at what the WCD is actually saying. So they say to find ways of sharing water resources equitably and sustainably, ways that meet the needs of all people as well as those of environment and economic development. That is, and they suggest that to move forward is to move through cooperation and not competition. Yeah. And then now this is the catch. The future for water and energy resources development lies with participatory decision-making using a rights and risks approach that will raise the importance of the social and environmental dimensions of dams to a level once reserved for the economic dimension. All right. What they actually end up saying is that empower civil society, and if civil society gets to be someone who is allowed to participate in dam making, then only dams can go forward. Now, many people would argue that actually this was an indirect way of saying once democracy comes in, once civil society comes in, once participation comes in, most dams will not get through pass muster and will not be built. So in that way, the WCD kind of pushed for a draw, but tilted on the side of civil society, right? So it looked like the fate of large dams was decided. It's over, and it's not going to happen at any great pace. But in the 21st century, something else happened. Large dams actually began to spike from 2005, 24, 2004 onwards, yeah, and really begin to take off by 2010. And there's an interesting paper which actually I think captures that mood very well. And I think this is one of the most significant papers that I've come across to explain to us why a certain way of thinking about large dams from 1934 to 2000 held, and after that, why it doesn't hold. Yeah. So this is a rupture. So the article is by Rohan D'Souza, Margaret Zwart-Tween, and Karin Barker. In fact, very significant voices on water matters, and they are all very accomplished writers and thinkers on the subject. In that paper, which comes out in the Oxford Handbook, I think, of Megastructures, in that paper, they say, they mark two dams. They say, okay, the Aswan High Dam is this dam of the 20th century. It is the dam that gives you the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse meaning to say that, you know, the Greek saying that if you look into a Trojan horse, then, you know, you'll get all the complications that you know, might happen. But then there is the, they point out the Nam Thun Dam, which comes up near Laos. And they say that this marks a different moment in dam construction entirely. There's no precedent to this. And they use the term Pandora's box. If the 20th century dam was a Trojan horse, that its promises were never fulfilled, and what it seemed to suggest was not what it really gave. The Pandora's box, anyone, I mean, most of you are familiar with that Greek story. The Pandora's box was about really opening up a box, and the unexpected sufferings then begin to come out. Yeah, right. And so they then begin to explain this sharp difference. All right, so I'm going to run this difference to you because it's very important for how I'm going to explain this rest of the paper. So the Trojan horse is really about progress, development, modernization. That's the complex in which large dams were introduced. And they argued that it was about extending this state space. Of course, advanced capitalist relations of production in commodified irrigation. This was all about centralization, about providing electricity for industries, and the nation state as a privileged format for rule. Very, very critical aspect to how to understand the Trojan horse and the dam, right? And that's the Aswan Dam as the metaphor for and dam for that understanding. Now, the Pandora's box, they point out, is a very interesting moment because Pandora's box cannot be understood without looking at financialization and globalization. Now, what is financialization? Really, what they point out is the blurring of boundaries between public and private. They talk about how a huge new set of actors, you know, in the Trojan horse, it is the state, it is multilateral agencies like the World Bank and so on and so forth. But in the Pandora's box, there are shareholders, equity holders, and how they package loans, debts, credit. Okay, so the financing now comes from finance houses, certain kinds of investment banks, and they really figure out the art of packaging debt. And interestingly enough, in all these arrangements, you don't really end up knowing who owns the dam. And much of the documentation by the consortium of funders, which is equity holders, debt holders, investment banks, and so on and so forth, these documents are secret, they're confidential. All right, there is no public scrutiny because this is a private arrangement. Yeah. So you're getting a shift now from looking at dams through the public goods framework and state framework to now looking at it as public-private partnerships, but essentially being run by equity, debt, and really how the packaging of that is done. Some of you would be familiar with what happened in 2008, the credit default swaps. Nobody knew who owned what. Yeah. So much of these banks now, which are investing in large dams, it is something of that order where the debt is completely without, in any sense, scrutiny or allowed. And what is interesting, like, for example, in India, in Arunachal Pradesh and the Himalayas, which I'll be discussing shortly, many of these dams which are then built are returned back to the government after 40 years or 25 years. So you see, just when the long-term impacts, environmental impacts kick in, that's when the debt is going to be taken by government. Yeah, that's when the crisis will come to the citizen, while the people who made the money have made it and have left. So that's a very interesting turn. So financialization of infrastructure as an asset class, that's the technical term, that infrastructure as an asset class, that every infrastructure will be soaking in huge amounts of credit, debt, all kinds of equity and shareholders. And if it's something like this, if I as a bank invest in a large dam, I can then sell it privately to other stakeholders. So if something happens, it's not the bank that actually put the money in, because I packaged that debt and sold them off. So you wouldn't really know who actually owns the dam. So what we have here is that infrastructure is turned into a financial platform. Yeah. And debt weaves in and weaves out of that without really anyone being able to figure out. And that's why I put this cartoon on the right-hand side. You can see amazing from up here. I can't even see the foundations that we built on. Let's go higher. That's the kind of situation. There's another great book on this subject, which was a tremendous source of learning for me, by Nicholas Hilliard. It's called Licensed Larceny. I think came out in 2011 or 2012, sorry, 2012. And they discuss with great care, infrastructure as an asset class, and how many of these banks and investment companies are looking for 30% rate of return on their investments. Yeah. So in all, what you're getting is the Namtune Dam that comes up in Laos marks a profound departure when previously infrastructure was principally built by governments as a public good rather than turned into a conduit to generate private profit. So this is now a huge shift in the way infrastructure is being conceptualized. So private-public partnerships is an arrangement which strives to combine state enterprises with private companies to realize public endeavors. Yeah. So I want to mark that as the first big shift in the difference between 1934 to 2000, and now you get financialization, which has become a very big driver of large dam construction and infrastructure in general. But that's not the only thing that's driving what's happening in South Asia. And that is why I feel that Pandora's box is not enough. And I'm trying to, at the end of this talk, advance a different notion than the Pandora's box. Okay. Before I end, I should tell you that they write that the Pandora's box is made up of webs of agile and rapid financial flows, obscure ownership, confidential contracts, and hence they compromise the ability for accountability and transparency. And I thought this really captured very well in this film by Forrest Gump. If some of you all have not seen it, please do. In which Gump says at some point, my mama always said, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So it captures, in my opinion, what the Pandora's box mood metaphor is. But that's not the only thing that's happening. There are two other big things that definitely mark Asia, South Asia, Asia in general. And many of you might be familiar with this, the Chinese proposed Belt and Road Initiative 2013. And this is definitely a huge conceptual shift in the drive for infrastructure, in what it means for Asia. Yeah, it's roads, and I will be discussing shortly. But that comes up in 2013. But in 2010, the ASEAN countries, 10 of them, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and several others, Philippines, Singapore, and so on. So there's a huge number. All of them come together under something called connectivity. Now, what both Belt and Road, the BRI, and ASEAN connectivity have in common is that they want to compress geography. They railway lines, roads, ports, and of course, energy. Very, very critical dimension of this new reworking of the geography of Asia. Yeah, right. And there are many astounding projects. You'd get something from connecting Amsterdam to Beijing, and even at some level, though India is not taken off, Delhi to Hanoi. There are these kinds of projects that are being imagined even as we speak. Yeah. What is interesting is that you're now looking at huge investments for growth, construction, infrastructure, and you can see this cartoon of Xi Jinping. BRI was initially called OBOR, One Belt, One Road. Yeah, but now it is called BRI. And so he's moving around in this huge tractor with all these kinds of pipes and nuclear plants and workers and trains and so on and so forth. And this is what China is unraveling. Unraveling as financialization and asset class. It's not just government. Huge number of Chinese banks are involved, investment companies involved, all kinds of equity firms. So it's a very, very complex layering of financial institutions. Same is the case with the ASEAN. Yeah, this is now, Asia is this huge game changer in terms of I would say something beyond progress, beyond development, beyond growth. It's a new envisioning itself of what Asia should look like. Yeah. Now it is amidst this that one must talk about, if you're going to compress land, you're also going to squeeze rivers. And so there are many instances where large dams are part of the BRI, and they're part of the ASEAN arrangement. For example, just to highlight one, 11 dams being built on part of the Mekong. Yeah. And these, like, you're getting a lot of these studies doing a couple of dams here and there. Yeah. And this is from an article that I picked up from Global Risks Insight 2016. 11 dams being planned on the Mekong. Now, there is a very interesting dimension to this. Dams on the Mekong is not really good because it interferes with fish movement. Large number of people do depend on fish as their primary source of protein and income. Yeah. So dams bring a bad, and Vietnam, for example, is now locked in all kinds of complications with with Laos, for example, which is supposed to be the battery for Southeast Asia. There are many of these complications. I won't wade into that, but it is fair to say that dam building is taking off because of BRI and ASEAN connectivity. There are also, of course, these cartoons you can see where with This is again something to do with Laos, and at the back you can see it's a China-funded, China bank-driven implication. I mean, many people are now connecting between dam construction and China's investment in this region. And Laos is very central to it's the throat of, at one level, of Southeast Asia, and the Chinese have got a very firm grasp on the dam construction in that region. Yeah. I should, having flagged the BRI and ASEAN, now I move to the third point, which was actually something that framed this talk about climate change and global warming. Is that also in some ways driving large dam construction? It's very interesting that Paris 2015, the Paris Accord, very significant document. Significant because, well, the INDC, that is the, I always forget the full form of it, the intended national development, something on carbon or whatever. Nations were privately making pledges. Each nation would come up with a pledge and commit how much carbon they were going to upturn. And in Paris in 2015, it's very significant. Large dams were not listed as renewables. They were listed as non-fossil, right? Not renewables. So you couldn't make a pledge on saying they're going to build large dams, right? That could not be part of your pledge. So many countries, and I'm going to take China and India, but before that, I want to underline two aspects. One is that for those not very familiar, I'm sure most of you are, but I'm going to run this again through everyone. Much of the climate change debate is divided into two sides: mitigation and adaptation. Now, mitigation is about, refers to efforts to cut or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases. And mitigation efforts really involves governments, big science and big technologies, yeah? And they mostly talk about switching to low carbon energy, wind, solar, geothermal, et cetera, et cetera. But this is really high discourse of states and governments and geopolitics. While adaptation is actually about adapting people to manage the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And so under adaptation, you really have behaviors or encouraging people to have green consumption. It's really about people and communities. This is the more democratic space. So now the large dam debate belongs to the mitigation. It often doesn't come under adaptation. Yeah, so it's still a high discourse and a security discourse, which is why states are really players in that at that level. Now, if you look at China and the Paris Accord, very, very ambitious targets. And mind you, anyone who's following China, China has been changing its attitude on climate change from 2009 onwards at Copenhagen, where they astounded everyone and surprised everyone by promising to reduce huge carbon levels. I mean, and this has a lot to do with China trying to rethink its position from a manufacturer to now a service sector economy, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to clean up. So what you get here is that you see China is promising to cut emissions per unit of GDP by 60 to 65%. I mean, we can get those details we can get into later, but essentially they're hoping to cut, and they're hoping to cut by substituting carbon emitting energy with renewables, yeah, solar, wind, small hydro, and so on and so forth. And what you see is that hydro is still mentioned for China. It's still a substantial part of their intended target to reduce carbon emission. And I've got all the numbers, but India, in contrast, is very interesting. Initially, I was quite surprised. India has promised a 175 gigawatt renewable energy target by 2022. And it's much more focused on solar, wind, biomass, and 5G of small hydel. Initially, I was quite surprised. I thought, wow, are they getting off the large dam question? Until I later found out that there was you can't really add large dams to your INDC pledge for renewables. Yeah, because it was large dams last year now became part of renewables. So in the next meeting, you can put large dams under renewables, but in Paris Accord, you could not. Large hydro, I think it was 25 megawatts, MW, yeah. Anything about 25 megawatts was not acceptable for renewable. It belonged to non-fossil energy, yeah. So that's why the Indian INDC looks rather forward and very ambitious, and one would think, okay, solar and wind, perfect. But actually, does that mean India is going to abandon the large dam quest? Actually not. And but before I get into that, let me just end by saying that overall, this is from another article that I recently got. The overall global annual net hydroelectricity is expected to surpass 18 gigawatts in 2020 and continue to increase in 2021, 2022, owing to the commissioning of 2 large flagship projects in China, and so on and so forth. That what I'm roughly saying here is that if you study the fine print, large dams are still on the table, they're still being built, and they will still be very much part of Asia's renewable energy drive and decarbonizing efforts. Yeah. So it's not the case that despite the pledges that you're not going to get this. So pretty much what I'm going to say is the cartoon below, that fish are still going to come up against large dams. Yeah, it's not something that's over. Finally, I'd also like to flag. Sorry, last but one, not finally, but I'd also like to flag. It's not only hydro. One of the most important things that's happening to Asia is rapid urbanization. All across Southeast Asia, China as well, India as well, there is a trend. And some of the numbers are very interesting. Like overall, you're going to see almost every year a 3.4% of people moving to cities. From 1970 to 2017, you got 3.4% moving towards urban areas. And then the numbers are staggering. I mean, you'd come across many reports with various numbers, but overall, what they'd be saying is that the trend is to increase urbanization. And in 2030, by one report, 55% of Asia will be in cities. Mind you, that's India and China and all of Southeast Asia, right? So 55% is that means to say that by 2030, more Asians will be living in cities than they will be living in villages. Yeah. So this is another trend that's going to be happening. And interestingly, what does urbanization do for large dam construction? I want to flag just one report, 2019, comes out in a magazine called Down to Earth. And this magazine mentions, it says, many large Indian cities have to source water from long distances, ranging between 50 and 200 kilometers due to exhaustion of remaining sources or pollution in nearby ones. The example of Tehri Dam highlights this clearly. The dam supplies water to Delhi, situated about 300 kilometers away. So what you're going to do is, once the village well is not going to help you, you're going to move to large reservoirs and pipe water. So if you're going to get urbanization, you are definitely going to get arguments for storage and for dams that can store them. Yeah. So I would add that to another driver besides the earlier ones that I mentioned, that urbanization. So it's not just hydro. You're actually going to look at piped water from reservoirs. Yeah. All right. I mean, this is something research that needs to be done, needs to be studied. I'm drawing this really from a few anecdotal writings, but I'm speculating that if village wells don't work, you have to pipe that water from someplace, and usually maybe from a long distance away. Yeah. I comes to the last and third point, and this is based on a very interesting report in 2008 by a very good friend of mine called Shripad Dhanmadhikari, whose name I'm unfortunately forgot to put in the slide. Shripad brought out this book called report called Mountains of Concrete, in which very painfully he tracked all the names of the dams and looked at lots of planning documentation documents, and he was able to roughly show that India had the ambition to generate 150,000 megawatts of additional hydropower capacity across a period of 20 years by building dams on the Himalayan region. And this is not something only India was going to do. Nepal, Bhutan, India, and Pakistan. 4 of these countries, they were going to take a slice of 2,400 kilometers of the Himalayas, and 160 or 170 odd dams are going to be built, okay, to generate hydropower. Now, Nepal, for example, suffers from a power deficit. So they said they have a case. Bhutan, similarly, hydropower, Bhutan doesn't use all its energy, but it's the single biggest revenue earner, right? India continues to have a huge need for power and energy shortages, so they want hydropower. And in Pakistan, the first and primary driver for large storage dams appears to be irrigation agriculture. That's, I think, almost 25% of their GDP is in the agricultural sector. So power may be secondary, but all these 4 countries seem to have a very strong desire now to begin damming the Himalayas, right? Seismically very dangerous and prone, but nonetheless. But while all this is going on, you are also getting very interesting tension building up around Assam or Northeast India between China and India. So lovely piece by Kaushik Deka and Anand Krishnan, again, 2015, but I loved their heading. It was called Bend It Like Beijing. So Beijing, according to them, China was planning a huge number of dams on the Yalong Sangpo. And in fact, today, as I give this talk, today there's already talk in India that it's very clear that they are building these huge dams and along the Brahmaputra. And India feels that they will be denied water because they'll be interrupting flows, or they will be releasing flows when India doesn't want it. It's complicated. I mean, that's a long, I'll happy to deal with it at question time. But the bottom line is this: India, therefore, is in a panic mode about what China is doing on this stretch of the Brahmaputra for India, but the Yalung Sampo for the Chinese. And so India is also building up dams so that they can hold back water. They can make a case if water is not enough water is coming in, right? So there is now this geopolitical crisis building up on the China and Northeast India, where there's competitive dam building as part of geopolitics, not necessarily always because of hydroelectricity. Now, even as I was preparing this paper, an excellent piece came out in The Wire by someone called Prem Shankar Jha, 11th March 2021. This is yesterday. I had to incorporate it in today's paper presentation, so it's just 1 day old. But it's very striking what Prem Shankar Jha writes. He says, among the 40 dams China intends to build in the Tibetan portion of the Brahmaputra basin, 20 are expected to generate 60,000 megawatts of power on the Yalung Sampo, 60,000. Why, after keeping it on ice for a decade, has China decided to revive this project now? He then asks. It cannot be a need for more power because by 2015, China had 300,000 megawatts of new generating capacity that it did not need and was forced to lower the capacity utilization in its existing plants to below 50% in order to give the new plants room in which to survive. So here's a country that has 300,000 megawatts excess capacity, suddenly building 60,000 megawatts of extra capacity. Doesn't make sense. So Prem Shankar Jha very carefully is then analyzing this, and he says, a far more plausible reason is that President Xi Jinping has allowed their revival for the same reason that he floated One Belt, One Road, renamed the Belt Road Initiative in 2013. As a desperate move to prevent mass layoffs in industry after the 2-year 4.3 trillion yuan fiscal stimulus program that began in 2008 had run out of control and ended up investing 24 trillion yuan in 5 years. Yeah. So means 2008 to 2013, and in 5 years they spent 24 trillion. So he says this has created huge excess capacities in every branch of the engineering, machine building, and heavy industries, which suddenly found themselves with no more orders in 2014. What he's saying is China is soaking up excess capacity by building large dams. And he says one of the reasons that India has essentially played itself out of this game is because we are not being part of the BRI project. India refuses to be part of BRI. And he says what China hopes to gain from the BRI is hegemony, not power. And that as long as India doesn't have a buy-in on BRI, China will continue to use up its excess capacity to build dams on the Brahmaputra. Now, how plausible this is we can always debate or whatever. But if the numbers are correct, which he's saying that China doesn't need the electricity, then why are they building it? So that's what I would like to essentially say is that geopolitics is also another driver for large dam construction. It's so you can see it's way out of progress, development, or economic growth. Huge number of calculations are now coming in to why and what is pushing large dam construction. So this is what it looks like to me. All these, it's a stack: financialization, BRI plus ASEAN connectivity, urbanization, climate change, and geopolitics. It's a stack of drivers now that seem to be pushing for large dam construction in Asia. Yeah, even as I have kind of argued elsewhere that what is a large dam? A large dam is a hydraulic transfer, and I define it in a double sort of explanation. I argue that it is the technical means. A large dam is the technical means to transform a local endowment into an economic resource. Transform a local endowment, which is to argue that before it was an economic resource, culturally it could be understood in other concepts and other categories and other notions. A river adjoining a village might not have always been viewed as an economic resource. It had great deal of cultural value, great deal of aspects that fed into a certain identity of a place. Yeah, it was not only a resource. But a large dam, actually, one of the first things it does is that it transforms it into an economic resource and then carries out this discourse and debate as an economic resource in order to then transfer the resource to more powerful constituencies. So it first transforms it conceptually into an economic resource in order to then take that economic resource and transfer it to more powerful constituencies. So the Tehri Dam, for example, is transferring its water to the city of Delhi, a more powerful constituency than the villages of Tehri. Yeah. So this is my definition of the dam. And now I see that this definition is being worked up in Asia through these different drivers. And so I beg to differ with Margaret and with Karen Barker and the others, that it's not the Trojan horse, definitely, but it's not a Pandora's box either. It's a stack. Yeah, I use the concept, it's a stack. It's a stack of drivers that are now moving a large dam construction, of which climate change is one of them. Again, I want to be very careful because this is being recorded. So the idea of the stack is not originally mine. It's part of a far more sophisticated scholarship by someone called Benjamin Bratton, who really talks about software and sovereignty. It's a very long argument. It's a 500-page book. I'm right now weaving myself through it. It's quite a dense read. But what he does say is that it's like an accidental megastructure in which a technological apparatus and a model for a new geopolitical architecture. All these are stacked and they assume a certain kind of coherence because of the ways in which they are layered. So what I'm arguing is that if you stack these drivers, then the large dam makes sense, and that one can see how it is emerging as a very, very significant asset in South Asian landscape. Yeah. So my argument is that it's not a Pandora's box; it is a stack, and it's all these different drivers that actually need to be stacked up. And if we are going to study for those who are interested in studying large dams in South Asia, I would say the approach should be to grapple with it as a stack. And so I should end. Thank you very much for your patience. I just wanted to underline with this last cartoon the difference between an economic resource and a local endowment. Yeah, and thank you so much. Right, so I'm done. I think I should stop the share and take the questions. I hope I didn't really go overboard. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you.
Zuki, we can't hear you.
Oh, Zuki, you're
muted.
You're muted.
There's a problem. Anyway, so I can just take over then. So thank you, Rohan, very much for this amazing tour de force. So it's not modernism. It's not high modernism. It's not authoritarian modernism. It's what you call a stack, accidental megastructure. So it's a sort of tour de force to the history of dams. But I just very quickly, while I think people are waiting. So, so China has over 23,000 dams, right? The US, America is next with around 9,000. India is around 5,000, right? So China has been pushing towards this accidental megastructure for a while. I mean, how does it pan out? You've got this whole history that you're sort of depicting of dams no longer being seen as part of our renewable sort of future. But there is this accidental way in which it's, you're building up towards this dam. And that's happening now suddenly in the post 21st century. It's sort of a galloping sort of effect. So is this true only for Asia, or do you think this is happening elsewhere as well, despite all the evidence to the contrary? And would you jettison the old sort of high modernism sort of analysis?
Yeah. Vinita, thank you. Actually, that's a very nice way to actually help me refocus. Okay, let me argue differently. What I'm saying is ideas of development, progress, economic growth, or modernization. These were the frameworks in which many of these large dams were discussed initially. And in those frameworks, there was an element of betrayal. This was a promise, it never delivered. In fact, it not only not delivered, it aggravated the crisis for those who were disempowered and those who became victims of that kind of process. Yeah. So there was a neat way of arguing. And even by those arguments, if you look at Sanjeev Khagram's book, Dams and Development, he argues that really by the 1990s, a whole transnational community of social activists, all kinds of solidarity groups emerged that were basically building up a transnational case against large dams. And that by the 1990s, they were winning and they were outwitting dam builders, yeah? Which is why the WCD, when it actually submits in 2000, it kind of literally declares it's over. We can't push this anymore, right? So those frameworks that can be captured from 34 to 2000, I think no longer holds today. And so now we are trying to discuss what's the new drivers, what's the new phenomenon. So Margaret Zwartien and all, they argue, oh, it's a Pandora's box. All right, it's a Pandora's box because all these agile, diffuse financial arrangements, they are something that is now driving these dams, and they are, we don't know, because they're so obscure, we will never be able to critique them unless dams are restored back in terms of they become accountable and they become accessible for democratic challenge. Yeah. In other words, what their argument about Pandora's box is that the new types of dam construction have actually prevented people from knowing how to argue against them, because they're so obscure and they're so invisible, right? So there's no way we can actually build. I mean, you don't even know who owns the dam. Now, I'm trying to simply say that the Pandora's box is not the only defining feature. That dams in Asia, being several drivers have moved in, climate change, geopolitics, urbanization, besides financialization. So I built up a stack and I say that stack gives the large dam coherence. That's really my argument.